I'm sure I'm going to get way more hands than I have time for, but what are some of the ways in which I could have improved that facilitation? Yeah?
Instead of does this make sense? Maybe asking checks for understanding to really see if they're
Excellent. And you were not, I did not flinch you, but you are taking me right to one of our characteristics of excellent facilitation, checking for understanding. So let's keep that in mind. Great, yep?
I was going to say that what we talked about earlier, just the counting down from 5 to 1, and then it's just like kind of the overall tone was like not really treating like us like we were adults or colleagues, just kind of condescending a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, and I want to stick with that for a minute. When I first was reading the session plan, I was kind of like, this seems like a really extreme example. I don't even know if this is appropriate, but I think that it is. And I think the way that this ends up happening is that as CMAs, you want to model for your core members the things that you do in your classroom. And I don't think we're saying like don't model these strategies. What we're saying is if you're going to model something, be very explicit and make that transition. Like I'm going to model this strategy for you, not that I'm just like doing it for you because I think that you wouldn't understand if I didn't. And then as far as your tone, I think it can be easy, especially if you're nervous. Like you are all teachers, or most of you are teachers. Like you will just by default slip into your teaching zone. So just to be conscious of those two things, to A, kind of make an explicit transition between when you're modeling something and when it's just your natural facilitation. And then just to be hyper-conscious of the fact that like you're a seasoned teacher, you're used to being in your classroom with your students, and this is a different setup. Yeah? Well, we'll go to both of you. Sorry.
And I don't know if this is something that you would have gotten to, but there was no like no share out to them or no sharing experiences. And just thinking about that because I know like when you do CLC sessions, that's a big thing where people like make sure you're pulling in their experiences so they feel like they're as much part of it as you are. And I'm thinking like that might be something for members that we all like to talk and want to share things. And so then the ones are like, oh, I have things I want to say, and if you're not getting them or anything like that, that's really part of the session.
And we'll get to that in a little while when we talk about what you can do in advance of the facilitation. Is that something you actually can plan and prepare for? I'll take one more.
There was a lot of information at once, and so I just stopped listening. Honestly, like that. I mean, I would assume that like we had a handout, and someone was hand like, where is the handout? Like that's how I would be. Like, where's the handout? I didn't look at like what she's saying. Like it didn't take into account like how people learn best or like nothing to really take notes on. And like there were no pauses. It's like next thing.
Yeah, there were kind of two danger zones that I can identify with. Like one is if you're not prepared and you don't know the information well enough, it's not coming out of you coherently. Like you're just saying what comes to your mind without any organization. The second is if you get nervous or if someone asks a question and you don't have time for it or you don't know the answer to it and you just feel ill-equipped to respond in the moment. So to kind of synthesize all of this, there are three things that we've seen strong, in this context, strong facilitators of group learning experiences. Of course, there are lots of traits of strong facilitation, but we're going to focus on the three things that we have seen people struggle with and that we know when they're done right, they do lead to core members achieving outputs. The first is using a tone that builds a sense of partnership. Second is to check for understanding. And third is to respond in the moment. So in terms of this tone, Taylor talked about this earlier today. Just talk to your core members like they're your colleagues, which they are. Like if you were with one of them one-on-one out in the hallway, you would not speak to them that way. So don't do it in a whole group context. Checking for understanding. This is kind of the same thing that we'll tell our core members. Like I kept saying, does this make sense? I think we kind of default to those questions, but really ask specific targeted questions. And if you're going to ask a question, like expect and wait for an analyzer response. I'm saying, does this make sense, but I'm not actually caring whether you respond or not. And then responding in the moment. So when someone asks a question, really listen to the question and have the answer. If you don't have time for the answer, that's fine. Just say, I don't have time with you, and then be genuine in your follow-up after the session. Also, don't forget about E1. If this is an area that you're uncomfortable with or that you struggle with throughout Institute, it may be worth checking out E1, which has all of these components of more facilitation. So clearly presenting content, facilitating practice, keeping up with your time, and then evaluating and tracking. Okay, so now we're going to contrast my very ineffective example with an effective one. And I can't think of a better person to do the effective example than your own board. So same thing. She is now going to do the same part of the session that I did poorly. And on your handout at the bottom of the page, you can again just kind of take notes on what she's doing well. This time around, you do have a frame of reference. You have these three things to consider. So that is using a tone that establishes partnership, checking for understanding, and responding in the moment.
Okay, can everyone hear me, or do I need to talk louder? Because I'm not going to have a microphone. You all hear me? I'm good. Right? You can hear me? Okay, good. So for this session, you're actually going to need to take out your comprehensive rubric, which is actually located in your CMA resource binder. So if you could take that out now, that would be helpful. Actually, take it out. And so while you're actually taking that out, I wanted to say that one of the strategies I use in my classroom with my students is when we're looking at materials or putting things away, I like to have them look at me when they're finished so I know that we're ready to move on. And I'll give you just a second to get that out and then we'll start. It really doesn't matter. You're going to need one to answer a question. So now we're going to spend some time talking about a document that you're going to be using throughout your time at work. The Teaching Leadership Rubric, or the TAL rubric. And this was created based on the Teaching Leadership Framework, which was actually developed from years of researching excellent teachers. And so we actually went into schools and looked at what teachers had done that made them able to achieve significant academic gains with their students. And basically the fundamental purpose of this rubric is to empower you to become a better teacher. And it's definitely not a one-size-prescriptive, like one-size-fits-all approach to teaching, but it's definitely a vision for what good teaching looks like. And I think a really good way to kind of illustrate this is through thinking about planning, right? We know that really strong teachers are really strong planners. And I think about my experience teaching, I taught actually next door to, in my first year, next door to a teacher who had been teaching for about 4 years. And our approaches to lesson planning were very different. In my first year, I needed to script out literally everything I was going to be doing for every minute of my day. Whereas the teacher next door to me really had a general idea of where she was going, so she just would briefly sketch out what she was going to be doing that day. Yes?
When you say the TAL framework is developed by real teachers, what do you mean?
Well, I'm really glad that you asked that question. We actually don't have a ton of time to go into that, but thanks for asking. So what actually Teacher America did is we researched excellent teachers across the board. So not just in low-income schools and not just new teachers, but teachers who have been teaching for 20 or 30 years and teachers even in high-income communities to see like what that one thing was across the board that led teachers to be able to lead their students towards dramatic academic success. And I know that it's a really brief answer to kind of like a big question, so if you want to come and talk to me after the session, we can kind of dive in a little more deeply. Good? Great. All right, so I was going to say, so the teacher next door to me and I had different ideas of what planning looked like. I was very like comprehensive, needed to plan out everything in detail, and she was just more basic vision of what things were. We were both really successful teachers, however, we just had different interpretations of what strong planning looked like. And so basically, essentially, the TAL rubric is a vision for what successful teaching can look like. We talked earlier in the session today about good teaching starts with a strong vision for what student success can be, and we know that the TAL rubric is a way for us to get there. So actually what I want to do now is go into the TAL rubric and kind of start looking at what it is and what's contained there. So if you can take it out, we're good? Great. And you'll see that the rubric is broken down into principles. And actually the principles are listed at the top here, and then they're also in the rubric itself. But the principles are setting big goals, investing students, planning purposefully, executing effectively, continuing